Three Go Searching by Patricia St. John. Chapter 6. When the Sun Went Down. There were still 10 vacation days left. Christmas was over, and David and Waffy turned their thoughts to the beach once more. The cold, rainy season had changed to the bright spring, which came early in the year to this land. The days were sparkling cold and clear in the mornings, but hot at midday. One afternoon, Mother took the children and Leela for a ride in the car and stopped at the foot of a rather boggy hillside where clumps of white jonquils followed a winding stream among the rushes. The children hurriedly pulled off their shoes and socks and waded ankle-deep in the water, picking bunches and bunches of the jonquils for the hospital wards. The air was heavy with the fragrance, announcing that spring was certainly on the way. In a week or two, blue iris spikes would be pushing up in the fields, and the almond trees would blossom. Joan, squelching her bare toes in the black mud and sniffing her flowers, felt delightfully happy. And when a little black lamb farther up the hill suddenly did a leap in the air, she tried to do the same and started frolicking about on the bank on her short, fat legs. The lamb, astonished, scampered off to its mother. Leela laughed till the tears ran down her cheeks, for she had never before seen such a chubby little girl pretending to be a lamb. David was happy too. The mornings were beginning to get lighter, and he woke every day to flaming sunrises over the sea. He awakened extra early one morning because Ragbag, sleeping beside his bed, seemed to be having a nightmare and had begun leaping up in his basket and growling at a fierce enemy who wasn't there. David turned over sleepily and tickled his ears to keep him quiet. Then he noticed the sky and quite forgot about being sleepy. Instead, he sat up and leaned his arms on the windowsill to watch. The coast across the water with its white beaches and little towns looked very near, and the mountains behind stood out dark and distinct against the tremendous orange glow that heralded the morning. The sea was still dark, but shot with gold reflections. The dawn gradually brightened over the island. David watched and felt that this day was going to be a special one. He would read some verses in his Bible, then get up. It was a special story that morning, one of his favorites, and he wished he could run up to the hospital and make sure that Leela knew it too. But she had already gone home to her village. It was the story in Matthew 14 of how Jesus walked on the water, and Peter tried to walk too. David could understand Peter trying on a morning like this, when every wave was tipped with gold and crimson. But it hadn't been a morning like this for Peter. It had been in the middle of a stormy night, before dawn, with angry tossing waves and not a star to be seen in the sky. How glad Peter must have been when he felt the strong hands of Jesus holding him up. David thought about the sea and the joy it was to him. Today he would find Waffy and they would go down to the sea, for today was a day for conquest and adventure. Perhaps they could solve the mystery of the little boat. Ragbag could smell adventure too, for he was quivering and sniffing with his paws on the windowsill. David opened the window wider, and the little dog shot out into the dewy garden and went running frantically around the lawn. David dressed quickly. His mind was full of thinking about the sea and the little boat and the glorious sunny hours that stretched empty before him. He hurried quietly through the living room where Dad was sitting and reading. Mother and Joan were still asleep, and Waffy never got up till about 8. He ran into the cool, sun-drenched world to look for Ragbag and raced happily around the garden with him until breakfast time. In the end, it was afternoon before David found Waffy, for a crowd of visitors came to call on Mother, and she asked him to stay and play with Joan while she sat with them and talked and read to them. The children built a house in the back garden and made it into a store. Joan spread out mimosa balls and pebbles and tiny fir cones and the blue fruits from the eucalyptus trees on large, flat nasturtium leaves. And David was all the different customers, one by one. First, he was the old cobbler whose eyesight was so bad that he had to put his nose right into everything he wanted to buy. Then he was the fat butcher, so stuffed with pillows he could hardly get into the shop. Then he was Lady Montague, who lived at the embassy, tripping in on high heels with her Pekingese and a servant behind her to carry her purchases. Joan was delighted and laughed happily, teasing for more, which so encouraged David that he went on thinking of different people to imitate until it was time for dinner. "You're a good boy, keeping Joan so happy," said Mother gratefully when they came dashing into the house, still laughing over their game. After dinner, Joan went to sleep, and David was free. He ran to the fence and looked down the slope. The sea was rippling and sparkling in the spring sunshine. The tide was low and the beach deserted. Not a single footprint disturbed the pale gold stretch of washed sand. He suddenly felt that he could not wait a minute longer. He tiptoed past Ragbag, who was asleep on the step, and then went charging up the path in search of Waffy. Ragbag, they had decided, was rather dangerous on the beach. When the great day came to solve the mystery of the little boat, everything might depend on their lying low and remaining unseen. Ragbag's panting excitement in the face of danger would not help at all. David met Waffy coming to look for him, and because it was a bright, clear afternoon filled with ordinary noises, they both felt extremely bold. It was nearly 3 weeks since they had been to the beach, and it was just the right sort of day for brave new beginnings. They looked at each other with shining eyes and started for the beach with silent consent. Both knew that something was going to happen, and both felt ready for it. They rebuilt their dugout with stones and sand, for the storms had flooded it and carried away its fortifications. While they worked, they talked in whispers, for it made them feel mysterious and secret. And all the time they worked, they kept their eyes glued to the near headland around which anyone entering the bay must come, unless they came straight down the cliff, as Waffy and David had done. Meanwhile, the sun had been moving farther to the west, and the hour was getting nearer when something might happen. Already the light was changing to that last clear glow that illumines every detail before it fades. Waffy crept close to David. "One build and one keep watch," he whispered. "If they are coming, they'll come soon." He crouched behind a large stone. David went on clearing out their ditch, working as fast as he could. His hands were quite sore with so much scraping and burrowing, but he was well satisfied with the result. No one passing could see them once they snuggled down inside. Then, suddenly, Waffy made a queer warning noise and darted back into the dugout, pulling David in beside him, backward, by the seat of his pants. And they crouched in the wet sand, clinging to each other with beating hearts. "Look," breathed Waffy, "they're coming." 2 swarthy men came around the headland and passed close in front of them. They were arguing fiercely, and both carried long objects under their tattered coats. "I say start as soon as it's dark," said one. "And I say we have time to go back to the town and fetch the others," said the second. "You're a fool," said the first. "We'll be late. All may be lost if we don't meet the messenger before dawn." Well, I'd like to finish the business tonight, replied the other. It's a full moon, and we're going to do it. I'd like to make this my last trip and go home with the money. I'm tired of this dangerous work. They stood with their backs to the children, muttering angrily. Then they moved on, still arguing, and began pulling themselves along the side of the rock, hand over hand along the crest. Whatever they carried was bound tightly to their bodies and needed no holding. One disappeared into the creek, and the other handed him some long, dark objects. Several minutes later, they had started their journey back, and once more they passed in front of the dugout. Very well, said one angrily, as you please. But if we are gone longer than half an hour, I'm not going. By dawn, the Coast Guard may be watching, and the messenger will not wait. Oh, we'll be back in half an hour, said the other soothingly. Don't be afraid, my brother. Before the moon is up, we'll be off. Let's get going. They passed on, walking fast. After a time, Waffy lifted his head cautiously and peeped over the side of the dugout. He could see the two figures just going around the headland, and a moment later they disappeared. David and Waffy exchanged a long look. It was much less frightening being two than one. David felt quite brave. Half an hour, said Waffy, rather breathlessly. We've got lots of time. We can creep along the top and see what they are. We'll be home before they can come back. It won't take us 5 minutes. David hesitated. His heart was bumping very uncomfortably against his ribs. But this was their chance, and he mustn't be a coward. He nodded, and they crept cautiously out of their burrow and looked all around them. It was very quiet. The light was fading now, and they could not see very far. David felt thankful for the dusk. He would not have dared to venture toward the little boat in the clear sunset glow, but in this dimness, surely it would be safe. Even if the men came back around the headland sooner than expected, the boys would see them in good time to make their escape up the cliff and home over the back fence. They tiptoed across the sand and scrambled up onto the crest of the rock. Waffy went ahead, and David followed. Waffy reached the top of the rock first and peeped over into the boat. What is it? Quick, urged David. Nothing, answered Waffy. The boat's empty. Unless, David, maybe there's something under the floorboards. It looks like a high floor. Let me see, said David, peering over his shoulder. They must have hidden those long things somewhere. Maybe that boat does have a false bottom. I'm going to get in and look, said Waffy boldly. You keep watch, David. Can you see the headland? Yes, answered David doubtfully. Just, but it's getting dark fast. Waffy, don't be long. Waffy slipped down into the boat with a small thud and began feeling swiftly around the edges of the floorboards. One was loose, and he lifted it with a little squeak of excitement. It was quite light enough to see what lay beneath. A neat stack of guns laid butt to gun barrel. They're taking them down to the frontier. It's for the war, David, breathed Waffy, triumph surging up in his young heart. David, we can't tell. We're on their side. Can you still see the headland? Just, said David uneasily, peering through the gloom. But come on up now, quick, Waffy. It's getting... Oh! Whoever it was gave him a sharp rap on the head and pinioned his arms behind him, had come very softly along the other side of the cliff, while David's eyes had been searching the headland. It was no use struggling, for the strong hand held him as in a vice, And a moment later, a swarthy, bearded face peered over David's head and saw Waffy standing in the boat, the raised floorboard in his hands. "So," said the man with terrible quietness, "you thought there were only two, and you thought they had gone away. But we do not leave our guns unguarded. There is always a third, and he too has a gun. Get down into the boat, you European, and sit there with your arms crossed. If either of you move, I'll shoot." He lowered David into the boat by his arm and the collar of his shirt and sat him down facing the sea. Neither boy dared to look up. David sat so still that his muscles ached, but he was far too frightened to move so much as a finger. He looked across at Waffy, who also sat like a statue, his face white as chalk against the gray dusk. The walls of the creek shut out the friendly shore lights, and the strip of sky above the sea grew darker and darker. But as David sat staring at it, half senseless and paralyzed with fear, he noticed one thing. One star was shining over the harbor, clear and lonely, like the star on his Christmas tree. And ever after, when the terror and darkness had all passed away like a bad dream, David could remember that star.